It's great to be back. I landed at LAX yesterday and was driving in, and I had to turn the AC on in January. So I was saying to myself, I need to come back for this.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And then I got stuck in traffic at 2:30 in the afternoon. So, to be continued. It's a great honor and privilege to be invited to contribute to this important event and be part of this conversation. Let me say, I think it takes a special kind of faith to invite an African across the country and give him 30 minutes to speak. Well, let me talk to you this morning about the way African-American contributions have shaped global evangelicalism. And here I'm just picking up on the African experience specifically. Now, the growth of African Christianity in the last half century is one of the most remarkable facts in the history of world Christianity. From about 9 to 10 million Christians on the continent in 1900, representing 9% of the entire population. Back then, Africans only accounted for 1.4% of the entire world Christian community. Fast forward 100 years later, and Africa had transformed into an area experiencing the fastest church growth of any region in the world. In 2010, according to a recent assessment, African Christians in the subcontinent represented 63% of the population. And today, the church in Africa accounts for about 24% of the world Christian population. Here is the question: who should take credit for this? A few months after I moved to Atlanta, I was asked to speak at an adult Sunday school at a large UMC church on the topic, "What is African about African Christianity?" This question reflects the prevalent notion that African Christianity is largely a Western creation. Okay, people look at denominations in Africa as being satellites of mother churches in Europe and North America. And of course, to this day, many of our books still depict the story of Christianity in the non-Western world as something that emerged when European or Western missionaries got on the ground. Today, this assumption that African Christianity is a Western creation or the fruit of programs and projects conceived in the minds of foreign powers is striking for at least three reasons. The first, as Lamin Sanneh points out, the same verdict is seldom applied to Islam, which is to say that whereas African embrace of the Christian faith is deemed an ill-informed imitation of Western forms, the spread of Islam in Africa is often seen as Islam's intrinsic worth. Islam is that kind of religion. It is spread, and its spread has nothing to do with external imposition. Of course, this first assumption ignores the fact that the vast majority of Africans historically never met a white missionary or had only minimal exposure to one, which is to say that most Africans have had the gospel from other Africans. The second reason why the assumption is striking has to do with the fact that it ignores the potency of indigenous elements. Stipulating the arrival of foreign agents as a starting point of the church ignores the pre-existing religious heritage where God was already at work, and it ignores the fact that religious change is dependent on the capacity of the gospel to respond to African questions and African dilemmas or concerns. Third, this assumption reflects the thinking that European or Western projects and activities are all there is to the story of modern Christianity. This ignores the extensive transatlantic movements associated with black Christians that were part of the story. And again, this black Christian contribution remains largely ignored thanks to the emphasis in our discourse on those Western initiatives and agency. Friends, the fact is that on the continent of Africa, it was Africans, either repatriates or liberated slaves, who laid the foundation stones of the present African church. Now, in the remaining time I have, I want to talk about the significance of this black Christian contribution to African Christianity. But first, let me define a few terms. I'm using the term black Christian in this context to refer to Christians of African descent outside the continent. Okay. Today, a more common phrase will be African diaspora. It's a little bit complicated, but understand it serves to distinguish Africans of the diaspora from indigenous Christians on the continent. Okay. The concept Black Atlantic, which was developed by Paul Gilroy in the 1990s, refers to this transnational network of African peoples within the Atlantic system who interacted with each other, who contributed hugely to intellectual production and creative innovations that are a major facet of the modern world. Surprisingly, Gilroy, in his analysis, pays very little attention to the African continent, which is to say he focuses mainly on Europe, the Caribbean, and North America. And he also gives very little attention to religion. However, the concept of a Black Atlantic provides a powerful tool of analysis because it allows us to think about this transnational connectivity, the extensive cultural exchange that went on between Africans on both sides for a long time, the sense of shared identity and common ancestry that allowed them to make common cause on a number of important projects. Finally, the notion of a black diaspora, a term that has now come into widespread use, removed from all its earlier religious connotations. Today, diaspora pretty much is synonymous with immigrant population. Okay? But in this context, I'm using it to refer to those millions of Africans transplanted from Africa to various destinations in the Atlantic world, predominantly as slaves. Okay, so that's out of the way. How do these three elements help us to explain the decisive contribution of African American Christianity and agents to the modern African church? Well, Black History Month gets going in a few days. And I think this affords us a unique opportunity to note that the emancipation of blacks is really not as historically distant an event as some of our conversations might assume. Between 1800 and 1860, only 40% of blacks in the Atlantic were free. And as late as the 1860s, 7 million Africans remained enslaved. Yes, emancipation came to this country 1865, but for many other blacks within the Atlantic world, especially in places like Cuba, emancipation did not come until about 1900. Okay, so all this is to say, in this period I'm reviewing, 1820 to 1990, the group of individuals I'm going to talk about were a minority. They were a minority because free Africans still at that point were a minority compared to the enslaved population. So their actions were also shaped by the abolition movement, because that's where the freedom comes in. And again, it's often forgotten that Africans played a very strong role in the abolition movement, that they collaborated with Europeans and other actors. They were part of formulating this idea that the return of blacks to Africa was indispensable for the evangelization of the continent. Blacks were part of that conversation, and they themselves agreed that they would make the ideal missionaries for evangelization among African peoples. Now, these Back to Africa movements focused on two settings. The first, my native Sierra Leone. Established as a home for freed blacks from Britain and North America and governed as a British colony from 1808, Sierra Leone was a centerpiece of numerous experiments aimed at the spread of missions in Africa. The black Christians who established the first church in modern Africa did so in Sierra Leone, which is to say that the story of modern African Christianity began not with the arrival of European missionaries, but with the migration of black Christians. Okay? Sierra Leone also became the context of the first mass movement to Christianity in the modern period. In the 1820s, it was supposed there were probably more Christians in Sierra Leone than in the rest of tropical Africa. The colony became a major center of Christianity, became a home to institutions that pioneered the study of African languages and trained the highest number of African ministers in the 19th century. One black Christian, Alexander Cromwell, I'll mention a little bit later, had this to say: Sierra Leone is the cradle of missions, the mother of churches, the parent of colonies. It was home to the oldest Christian community in sub-Saharan Africa, and is true to this day. The next context is Liberia. Well, in 1800, free blacks in America numbered about 59,000. Many Southerners saw blacks as a threat to the institution of slavery. First, because to them, it challenged the natural order of things to have Africans free. Who knows what they will get up to? They start thinking above their station, and if they mix freely, they'll start an insurrection, and so on and so forth. And so the idea of sending freed Africans to Africa had a very powerful pull on the imagination of whites. Okay? And these sentiments led to the founding of the American Colonization Society, which was designed specifically to establish a colony to which free blacks would be repatriated. Now, the African Colonization Society was essentially a Southern initiative. It was dominated by Southerners. It was dominated by individuals who believed that the removal of blacks was a way to resolve America's racial dilemma. It was dominated by people who argued that establishing an overseas settlement to which blacks would be repatriated would make many slave owners more willing to support emancipation, if they know that those who were freed would not stay in this country. Among blacks themselves, this was a very complex issue. There were many who supported emancipation, but there were many who were opposed to it. They were opposed to it. First of all, the fact that the idea came from Southerners meant that they were instinctively opposed to it. The fact that it reflected notions that blacks were too degraded a people, were unfit to have a place in American society, just seemed wrong. And of course, many argued that they had helped to build this nation, and they weren't going anywhere. So there were very powerful resentment and resistance to the idea of immigration. But there are many blacks who also supported emigration to Africa on grounds of divine providence. That was the key argument. The belief that this inhuman slave trade was part of a divine design for the redemption of Africa, that African slavery had led to the Christianization of blacks who were now equipped to spearhead the evangelization of the continent. And many were convinced that this would also allow them to prove African capability and worth. Well, in any case, a land was identified, a settlement on the West African coast, named Monrovia after President James Monroe, who was also a wealthy Southerner and part of this new movement. Liberia was conceived of as a black republic that would be this new beacon of life in Africa for emancipation and redemption. Notable individuals who made the crossing included Lord Carey, who had founded the first Baptist church on the continent. It's still there today, the oldest Baptist church in Africa. Alexander Cromwell, born in New York, BA from Cambridge University, spent 20 years as an educator in Liberia, training a host of indigenous Christians as teachers and catechists. In the long run, there wasn't a mass movement. Some 12,000 blacks eventually immigrated to Africa under the auspices of the American Colonization Society. But Liberia became a very important center of economic opportunity as well as international trade. But it also became a testing ground for confrontations, the old confrontations, racial confrontations and tensions between black and white, denominational rivalries and competition, social divisions between various groups. Unfortunately, 150 years later, those same tensions and divisions would erupt in a bloody civil war that would see 200,000 killed. So, who were these missionary agents that helped to transform Africa? I'm going to speed it up here because I'm running out of time. But one point I need to make is we must know that this effort was predominantly Protestant. In other words, there were very few Africans repatriating from Latin America in this case. There's an example of a major movement on the slide. Most of them settled in Lagos. But by and large, the most sustained, the most significant movement of blacks in terms of African Christianity came from among Protestants. As I said earlier, this was a very small group. They were an elite group. They were marked by freedom, faith, and education. I want to mention faith because it's important to recognize that the men who inspired these connections and initiatives were marked by deep religious convictions. As David Northrop puts it, I quote, "Almost without exception, the pioneers of the Black Atlantic were sincere Christians, not simply because it was the dominant religion of the diaspora, but because they found strength and fulfillment in Christianity's story of redemption and equality," unquote. Here are a few of the names. I'm sure you recognize most, if not all of them. The slave boy who became a bishop and pioneered the most extensive missionary effort in Africa in the 19th century. In many ways, Bishop Crowther's life mirrored the rise of the African church in the 19th century. Wilmot Blyden, easily the most learned and articulate champion of Africa and the African race in his time, okay, whose ideas on African nationalism and so on stimulated emigration to the continent. Let me introduce the next individual because he's from the West Indies, and I want to make it clear that the West Indies, the Caribbean, was also part of this story, that often when missionary agents were searching for blacks to be evangelists in Africa, they also turned to the West Indies. And Thomas Batch Freeman is recognized as the father of Ghanaian Methodism. The son of a West Indian father and an English mother, he served in Ghana as a missionary and had a long and distinguished career also as a Wesleyan pastor. Established churches in Ghana, Nigeria, and present-day Dahomey. And finally, William Shepherd arrived in the Congo as a missionary from the Southern Presbyterian Society and worked there learning African languages, became known as the Black David Livingstone. Okay. So what am I saying about the impact of this Black Atlantic, which involved interactions and interconnections between Black Christians and African Christian leaders and its implications for African Christianity? What does this mean? Well, in closing first, it means that they were a major factor in the evangelization of the African continent. That in some ways, this Black element was far more significant, far more dominant in the establishment of the African church than any Western or European agency or initiative. In fact, Black missionaries would overtake white initiatives in their work on the continent. Powerful voices will emerge in the church in the U.S., laying the foundation for this, including that of Henry Turner. But there's a second component to this. In the transformation of the African church, there was a transfer of consciousness from the African-American experience into the African environment. And it's interesting, this verse played a prominent role in that transfer of consciousness, giving birth to the idea of Ethiopianism, giving birth to the conviction that Africans should be leaders in demanding racial equality, in defending African selfhood, in promoting African ability, and insisting that African advancement could not take place without African agents and African initiatives. Well, here are some of the pictures of those African agents we're talking about that transformed African Christianity and laid the foundation for modern forms that today sees Pentecostal charismatic movements on the continent having a huge global impact. Friends, the dynamism of African Christianity has ultimately proven to be irrepressible. The African-American element in this story is one piece of the African-American contribution to global Christianity as a whole. Unfortunately, this story is not being told, or it's not being told well enough. To this day in this country, in many of our classrooms, Black evangelicalism as a significant and distinct strand of the evangelical experience, even in the U.S., is largely submerged in the narratives. Well, that's why you establish a Black Studies Center. But let me say this before I step down. You know, a Black History Month is a blessing and a bane. It's a blessing because, yes, for 1 month, you can get focused attention, discussions, and awareness on the specific experience, its significance within the American reality. It's a bane because for all the other months, everybody can go about their business. Establishing an African-American center holds great promise. You can bring together resources for research, for discussion, for promoting ideas and influencing the discourse in important ways. But it's a problem because unless it is managed the right way, it allows everybody else to go about their business because they can say, well, we have a center there, they're doing what needs to be done. Friends, we have a broader story to tell. Let's not shrink from that task. Thank you.